Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Flight Path SDI's podcast on everything UAS and the UAS industry. I'm here with the regular crew. We got Steve Ross, Don Heon, and James McDaniels. It's been a while, guys. How's everything going?
Real good.
The year is flying by. Good to see you guys. I feel like I haven't seen you guys in a while.
Yeah, it's been what, like a whole month or so? And it felt like it's been like a week, if that. Every day's a lightning bolt, it seems.
Not for
just-
me.
yeah,
I
the
was in
year is
Japan, and
flying
then I was
by.
sick for a whole week and a half. So the
Yeah,
Japan
Christian,
trip
how
went
was
by pretty fast. But, being
How was
sick,
Japan,
that sucked.
Christian? What was your favorite thing you
Pretty
did in
good.
Japan?
I just gained 9 pounds. So doing that was probably my favorite part. Everything that
Was
How
it
is
the
that
beef?
possible?
No, I
though?
gained like 3 pounds, but it's a good thing that I got sick because I lost 5 pounds from being sick. So that was
So
awesome.
you're back on a negative. Got
Yeah,
it.
exactly. I lost weight, but I still even walked, miles and miles every day, as they say you do over there. But
That was gonna be my follow-up question. Like, how did you gain weight with all the walking
oh
you're
no,
supposed to do over in
you should
Japan?
see the amount I ate. So if you follow me on Instagram, you can go to my highlights for Japan 2025, and you can see all the Wagyu and Kobe beef that I ate. So every day.
It was all
Wow.
Yeah,
food.
just rub it in my face, Christian.
Yeah. You wish. So anyway, today we're talking about, by this outline, it says we're talking about open versus closed source in the UAS industry. What does that mean?
So, if I may give a brief version of it, all autopilots work off of a open or closed source firmware. It's essentially the software for your brain. When we say closed source, it's something that others can't get into and change or reiterate or improve unless it's by the person who controls that firmware. And open source is, hey, here's how this works. Here's the autopilot brain software. And anyone is welcome to come in and make changes, make improvements, and so forth, and make it better as a community. So that's the main difference between what open means versus closed mean.
Yeah. So, James, when did you start building drones? Like, what year was that for you?
That was in, well, when we're talking about drones or like even just radio controlled aircraft, that was 2007. So radio
Okay,
controlled
so
aircraft in 2007, but my first quadcopter was in 2010.
okay, yeah. So back then we didn't have any graphical user interfaces like ArduPilot or PX4 or any of that open source stuff. So it was definitely a challenge back then in 2010, 2012 to build a drone because there was no configurator out there.
Correct. But now with a lot of open source community members, and it's not just like here in the US, but throughout the entire world, there's a ton, if not thousands, of participants that work to improve these softwares each day. I mean, they even have their own conferences at a yearly basis now, and they have their own foundations and communities that it's become open source firmware has become more, how do I say, is feasible for actual commercial usages for autopilots that are out there. So it's really cool to see the change over time, for sure.
James or Don? So I know open source is something we're going to have to start focusing more on because we've had such a, I guess, prevalent closed source in DJI. Is that right?
I would say that's a correct statement. DJI is definitely more of a closed source firmware. A lot of like the core code that runs the autopilot for them, you can't necessarily interact with. Now, that's not to say that you can't interact with, how do I put it, make third-party applications to interact with it through what's known as a software development kit or SDK. So DJI does have an SDK, but that doesn't mean you can't go in and add a flight control algorithm or something that's more advanced than what's currently in there. So that's about the summation of it.
I want to get your guys' opinion. Do you feel like it's more of the community, the users asking for this as a way to access open source, or is it being forced on these companies by governments, or is it something else?
That's kind of a loaded question. I know that the industry wants to, especially the FAA, they want to be able to track and document and collect data on all the drones that are flying in the national airspace. And we can't currently do that because a lot of those drones that we fly are from a closed source ecosystem, i.e. DJI or Autel. So none of that data we can actually collect. So I think there's a big push, not only from the FAA, but from the open source community to start to mature and develop this software so that people can begin to use it and create their own systems so that that data can be tracked and be sent to the FAA. So I think now more than ever, there's a big push to get that open source kind of dialed in and mature a lot more so people can use that and build their own systems.
You think that push is coming from the manufacturers themselves?
I'm going to interject here a little bit. So there's Don's correct, but to add on to that, right, there is some ideas about control of the data, like who actually has access to the data, like what amount of data does the person who controls the firmware actually have access to. Like one of the main things that people bring up about, you know, what all the ban discussion is out in the industry about now is like, how is there a capability to possibly on the back end have someone's imagery, their videos, their metadata, their flight data, you know, automatically be backfed to the manufacturers of the aircraft system. Now, granted, none of that has been officially proven, and there has yet to be a security review, and companies like DJI have come forth and are really forthcoming with, hey, like we're ready to give all that we need to give in order to get through the security review process, which hasn't even been started yet. So there's that concern of, like, let's make a call back to a situation where DJI used to have the capability to prevent you from taking off if you were within a controlled airspace area that you weren't allowed to take off from, and there was no room for takeoff. It's, if you look at the Federal Aviation Administration's Uncrewed Aircraft Systems facility maps, it'll show you areas of where you're allowed to even fly within 100 feet of your takeoff altitude location, and areas where you're not allowed to take off at all because the altitude is 0. So DJI was able to put in a safety feature that would prevent someone from taking off completely if they were in that area, unless, of course, they had authorization. So when you think about it, okay, if they have the capability to do that, some people may think, do they have the capability to turn that capability back on nationwide? So that's what some people might think. I'm not saying that's what could happen. There'd be a negative lookout on the company in general if that was the case and that was something that they employed, because now they're a international organization. Whoever bought their systems is going to see that action and be like, well, wait a second. So that's a huge risk if they were ever to decide to do that. So there's a lot of considerations there. But even with that being said, now with individuals seeing the use cases for these things and wartime efforts, security control, and all that stuff, it makes it even more of a concern. So, and there's a realization that we in the United States don't have a large manufacturing capability to produce our own systems. So right now, there's a lot of companies and a lot of individuals turning to that open source community. And these firmwares like ArduPilot and PX4, they've been around since 2011. Even before that, PX4 was first released in a white paper in 2009 out in Zurich. So they've been around for a bit, but they've been slowly and developing more and more as more companies have been starting to incorporate their use. So I think for your question, it's a mix between a multitude of different external factors. It's the idea of defense. What can we control and what can't we control? Do we really want to put the risk of giving someone the upper hand if it's a possibility or a capability that closed sourced firmware or that manufacturer may have? And how do we overcome that possibility? And then do we want to have that same possibility happen on the commercial setting at a large scale and instead have that be more with our control? And when you're talking about open source, it's up to for everybody. Now, granted, there can be guidelines of the community. Like there's a wonderful organization known as the Drone Code Foundation that has essentially helps guide the development community and kind of controls, hey, what do you want to submit? What do you want to improve? What do you want to commit or create or improve on the software or the code or anything that's within that foundation, and gives a lot of good education behind it to say, we can do this and we can do this carefully, but yet it's still open and no one manufacturer is controlling it, right? So there's that's just my initial thoughts. I know there's a lot to package in that, and there's a lot to consider, and I'm sure there's more questions around it. But this is a multi-factored reasoning as far as like why open source is becoming more under the spotlight than it has been in the past. There have been American drone companies. I've worked with drone companies in the past, 3 drone delivery companies that all used either ArduPilot or PX4 and created custom versions of the code for them, and they could because they were able to control the code and be able to control what the capabilities were. So sorry if that's a bit of a long answer.
No, it's great. So like with the security part of it and the government concerns, I mean, do you feel like that's driving more pushback though, or is there more people just like considering this is now par for the course and accepting it and just finding ways to innovate with it?
So companies out there that we know are large in scale, very popular, are able to innovate. They're able to take individual customers and clients' feedback and innovate and always put out better products, right? And it could be the same thing with people who develop drones using open source firmware or open source components, or components that are not all just from one manufacturer and created by the community or created by a manufacturer who then puts it out there for the community to use in their drone designs. So I think it's, besides security concerns, let's think about it like this. Besides the security concerns, what is out there that is being done to actually test those security concerns? Has there been any action done on the review of DJI or Autel, and what is actually being done with the data on the back end to say, okay, these aircraft are actually safer than we thought to use, and we don't have to worry about the data issues that I mentioned earlier. And already the FCC has come out and unanimously voted for themselves to be able to retroactively, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Don, retroactively revoke previous approvals for previously approved products. So that means that aircraft like my DJI Mavic Pro could be retroactively put on the non-covered list, which essentially means that it can no longer be sold. It can no longer be used. Now, granted, can you still fly it? Is it going to just immediately stop working or brick itself, if you will? No, that's not the case. But you can still fly it, but it'll be considered, not approved by the FCC, if you will. So besides security, there's now, because I would say security is the one kind of pivot point now that some people are using as an excuse or a reason to say like, hey, you got to make this switch to open source software that's out there. But then again, we don't have any proven security concerns, but we don't have any unproven security concerns. So on both sides of the coin, it's safe to still go after the other options that are out there and try to improve them and make them better for the industry overall. I'm not saying don't use open source, but definitely keep growing it more.
Okay, since we're talking about retroactive bans and DJI bans and all that stuff, as a guy who's just invested in a bunch of DJI drones, like I've got this.
Ooh, it's still in the box. Where's the unboxing video, Christian?
Well, like I said, I've been sick, and that's why I don't want to fake an unboxing. So that's why it is still in a box. And then I still have my Air 3S and my Avata 2 coming.
Nice. You got a whole fleet.
So am I going to be able to use these things? As a guy who doesn't know and doesn't, follow as much as you two do, Don, what does this mean for me as a guy who just invested in a bunch of DJI drones?
Well, like James said, I mean, they're not going to stop working, so you can use them. I don't know what the future looks like as far as authority to fly them in airspace. That's yet to be seen, but I guess we'll just have to wait to see what the industry comes up with as far as where DJI is going to be positioned inside of the national airspace. I have no idea what's going to happen with that. I assume that most DJI drones or Autel drones or Skydio drones will still be able to fly in the national airspace, but I don't know the laws, rules, and regulations surrounding Chinese-made components and how that's going to affect the national airspace in the future. So that's yet to be seen.
I agree with Don that, yes, you'll still be able to fly them. It's not like they're just going to be able to turn off the frequencies that you are used to control the drones, and then all of a sudden you just can't even connect them anymore. You can power on, you just don't see anything. That's not going to be the case. There's also the question of, okay, well, they're going to work. Can I still use them for commercial purposes then? Well,
That's
nothing
what I'm
really
interested in.
nothing has been spoken to that, at least for the commercial enterprise operation side. Now, we already know on the federal and government side, like you're not supposed to be using these things because they're put on a list already. They're not on an NDA AA compliant or a blue drone list. So that we already know. As far as like limiting their commercial use, that hasn't truly been stated yet. I guess we'd have to do a little bit more research on if it's not on the FCC covered list, are you still able to use that piece of equipment as part of your business? And that's a more general question. I mean, and I'm sure while we're on this, someone can do a quick search on that actually and probably find the answer. But with that being said, I would say for now, Christian, you're still able to use those for hobby and as well as long as you have your Part 107, still use them for commercial use until FCC or somebody else like the FAA comes out and explicitly states, hey, because this is no longer on the cover list, you are not able to even fly this for commercial purposes or even hobbyist purposes. But that would be a little bit of an extreme case.
I was going to say, if that's the case, there's going to be a lot of pissed off people.
I mean, and when you
Like
say
the
a
whole
lot, like
industry
what do you
operates.
think? Yeah, what's I don't know the numbers. What's a good estimation of commercial DJI use for drones?
That's
Oh,
that's a total guess, but I'm going to say at least 70 to 80%.
so when you're saying 70 to 80%, he's talking about like users in the market because DJI has a 70 to 80% market share in the United States as far as like how many drones are sold compared to other companies that sell drones in the United States, as well as those in the UK and around the world as well. I would say easily just thinking about and we're not talking about the prosumer or just the enterprise. We're also talking about like the mini series, the ones that people buy their kids for, Christmas toys. That could be it's easily in the millions. But the question is it close to the tens of millions or is it at the tens of millions? And that's a lot of product. And that's obviously not counting the people that have bought and then destroyed their aircraft or crashed it and haven't made it flyable again. But for the individuals who still have those drones that they've bought, the drones that they're using for businesses that are a huge investment, like $100,000 or more, if not more than that, and are, of course, that's not something that you could just go and replace because someone comes along and says, "Hey, you're not
you
allowed
can't
to
use it.
fly it anymore."
Yeah,
And so that's why we kind of smile a little bit on the perception of the possibility of these organizations being able to come in and say, "Okay, these are no longer on the cover list, but that doesn't mean you can't keep using what you have for continued business." The issue on that is that because they're no longer on the cover list, they're not going to get through customs. They're not going to come to the United States. So then that begs the question. We're going to get into what I like to call the Cuba situation, where you close off the country from getting anything new. So individuals have to get really creative to keep the products that they're using going. So we might when Cuba opened back up and people were going to Havana, still seeing cars that were being that were from the 1960s and 1950s that were still being driven and kept running because of the creativity of the individuals and the desire to keep that equipment or those assets running. So hopefully it doesn't get that extreme, but you can kind of envision an idea when the FCC says, okay, no longer on the covered list. That means no spare parts, or is that the drone and all of its components, or is it just the drone itself? Can I still get replacement components and so forth? So maintenance drone companies are going to be a big thing as far as just to keep DJI running. If what Don or I are describing is the actual case that you see, Christian.
okay. So I should still be able to use my drones,
You're
surpass
definitely
my
safe for now.
SDI income with all the money I'm going to make by
Just keep it in the box.
videography and stuff like that.
Steve is saying don't even do an unboxing video, bro.
Yeah.
If you don't connect to the internet, they can't downgrade it. Okay.
Right.
Hey, he's not wrong. As long as it doesn't have an internet connection, it doesn't know if it needs a firmware upgrade or downgrade.
There you go. That's why I was like, man, I need to unbox this soon. December 23rd.
In like a few years, it could be worth a lot of money. Like this is a firmware XXX4, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
It's funny you mentioned that, Steve. One of my old coworkers still has the original Phantom 4 that he never upgraded the FlySafe database because it does not have the airspace that James was talking about, that authority to like stop you. So he's actually specifically not updated it so that he can continue to fly it without that airspace.
Yeah. Just through airports and, you know, everything like that, military bases. No, no restrictions.
I remember being younger and like doing that same thing. Like when I used to jailbreak iPhones, you know, like you'd avoid doing updates so you wouldn't lose your jailbreak.
Yes. Yeah.
You could have the
even with,
coolest
the Apple
ringtones.
increased-
Yeah.
Right?
No, I
You could
remember
have, like,
back in the day,
customized
the coolest thing was you could turn your phone into a Wi-Fi hotspot with unlimited data and as not part of your phone plan. And they do. Like I remember eventually I got called out on it like by my provider, but I never paid for it.
Steve,
You heard it right
that's
here,
excellent.
folks.
I think
And-
we're past the statute of limitations on that one. I'll admit to it today.
and even like obviously like you can get like emulator apps for like old, you know, Game Boy Advance to play on your phone. You used to have to jailbreak the iPhone to do that.
Yeah.
To run
you
emulators
felt
on
like
it.
such a hacker too. Like, oh man, I'm gonna get in here and do this.
Right.
When really it was just some graphical user interface that you download, you plug in your phone, and then it just breaks it for you automatically.
From some random site on the internet. Like, oh yeah, here's my device. Just have access to everything on there. You know.
And you download it through like LimeWire.
Yeah. I don't know if it was that bad, but yeah, pretty much.
Sorry,
Anyway.
Steve, you and I might be self-reporting here.
Right.
You wouldn't
Okay.
download a car, would you?
Sorry.
So
Don't steal
closed
music.
source versus open source. What else we got? What do we need to talk about?
So go ahead, Don.
Well, I was just going to kind of make a statement here. Considering where the industry is going, eventually, you know, there's going to be more and more push to take control of the data that's in the airspace, the drones that are flying in the airspace. I want to ask you, James, and for our viewers out there, how important is it? Because every small business that has a DJI as part of their business, right? That drone, you plug in a battery, you turn it on, you arm it and go, and it flies. There's no, like, it's essentially like having training wheels on. You just get on and go, right? So knowing this shift of going to, I wouldn't say open source, but non-DJI products, there has to be a starting point. And one of those starting points is with open source software and creating and developing your own type of system. How important do you think it is for people that have flown DJI drones or other types of proprietary systems to be able to understand the system flow and how the drone is composed and how it communicates? How important is it to have that knowledge to not only be successful in a small business, but be successful in the industry?
I think because of the stage that we're currently at, with the amount of manufacturers that we have, not just in the United States, but abroad as well, that have created systems that have successfully commercialized the use in the models of those open source firmwares and softwares, that it's very important for individuals to understand the workings and what those firmwares are, you know, how they work within the drone itself, and all the other additional steps that they may not be used to trying to be checking on the aircraft before they can just unfold the props, arm it, take off, and let it do its thing. Now, that's not to say that manufacturers of the space already that are either using the ArduPilot or PX4 firmware, and just to understand, it's not just those two. There's others out there like Betaflight or iNav, for example, but they're more for like high-speed FPV acrobatic style drones. But even iNav has added the ability for GPS navigation in there, so it's slowly advancing. So your choices aren't limited. But what I'm trying to say is that these firmwares allow companies to download them, hold on to their versions, and then they can make very customizable, very refined versions of them to then put into their drone that they've manufactured or developed. So it's still possible to get close to a DJI level ease of user interface when we're talking about the ease of operation of the drone. But because of the limited amount of companies that have been able to do that so far, and the more manufacturers and people that we need to be able to develop these aircraft now and to that level of ease of use, it's very important for us to know all the information in the background of the open source community and what's out there, what's available. I'm serious. Like for our viewers, look up Drone Code Foundation. A lot of educational resources on there that you can learn about the firmware. I mean, in our classes, we cover how to set up a quadcopter using the PX4 firmware and how to interact with that firmware and how to set up an entire aircraft using that firmware and then get it to the point where it's flying and flying reliably. Go out there, look up these names that we're mentioning, and it's not just on the ArduPilot firmware side. It's also on the software side for ground control stations. Mission Planner, that's a big one. And then there was also Q Ground Control as well. And Q Ground Control is part of the Drone Code Foundation. And they are constantly putting out new updates with improvements. And companies can even download the version of that software and customize their own ground control station software out of it as well, or even use its operational code as a working base for a new graphical user interface that only improves upon the ease of use for the person. So again, I answer, it is important to know these at this time until we get to a point where there's so many manufacturers or drone developers that are successful and holding in the industry, and that could take half a decade to a whole decade to reach. For now, we just as commercial operators should know these things.
So, like as a regular consumer, such as myself, if I don't know that stuff, then say DJI goes away, I'm bound to whatever company is utilizing it, and they're charging whatever astronomical amount they're charging for whatever, same level drone that I would be getting at DJI. But, now there's no restriction, or the restrictions are in their favor because they can charge whatever. So
Not just the charging. And if you think about that, that's like a macroeconomics of scale thing. So,
but as a regular consumer, that doesn't know how to program open source code for,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, like if you bought like a ready to fly drone that was using PX4 firmware, if it was made really well by the manufacturer, you wouldn't have to worry as much. But when there was a problem with it, I mean, DJI is when there's a problem with it. It's not like you can go in there and like know how to fix it besides doing the basic things like recalibrating or maybe replacing a motor. It's about the same thing that you would experience with an open source drone, except maybe you try to arm it one day and it doesn't arm and it beeps at you and you got to figure out, okay, what does that beep mean? did the manufacturer provide me a manual for this? And if they didn't, where do I go to try to figure this out, instead of it being like, all right, this thing isn't working. I've been provided a manual by DJI. I know how to look at this and fix it. So,
and that's the thing that you brought up, a manual. And for the most part, if you buy a DJI product, whatever drone it is, typically most people don't read the user manual. It's actually so easy that you don't even really need to read the user manual. The interface is laid out in a way that just is so intuitive and makes sense, and you can just navigate it. But coming from that ecosystem and going into this open source ecosystem where manufacturers are taking this code and creating their own version of the system, now it's not so user friendly. And eventually we'll get there. It'll take some time. But coming from an ecosystem where you don't need to even read a manual and it just is so easy to use, and then going into another system where you actually have to spend the time and understand the manual and understand the ecosystem of how the drone works, that can be quite a different landscape going from proprietary to open source.
And you make a good point there, because Like I've seen it in companies I've worked for that you go into a company that's using a closed source system that's well manufactured, that's created for ease of use interface, and it takes maybe a day to 2 days to train someone up on how to use that and to where they're actually effective and they can be left alone at using the aircraft with the training provided. Where in companies that I've worked with that have used open source firmwares, again, these companies were still developing their aircraft. It would take a week and a half to 2 weeks to train a remote pilot in command to be able to sit at a computer and command and control this aircraft to the point where you could leave that individual alone and rely on them to be able to operate safely and to resolve issues that happen during flight with that. Now, could that be different when we're talking about a system that is using open source firmware that has become a finalized and finished product? I mean, we have like the Skydios, the inspired flights, and all that. And they could have a really good thing that's ready to go that probably only requires that 1 to 2 day of training in comparison to what I just mentioned. But the amount, like we were saying earlier, the amount of those manufacturers is low.
So apples to apples, so something like my new Mini 5 Pro, what is the American made equivalent to that that's out now? And what's the cost difference? Just as a normal consumer person inquiring about it.
Wow.
You're shaking your head, James. Is there none?
Yeah.
There's nothing?
I
In
don't.
my world, there's none.
Okay. So
I don't know if there's something that's ready to fly on the FPV side, Don, that, may be comparable, but right now, as far as I know, that's a no, unless you could talk about all the other Chinese clones that are out there.
Yeah.
like
We're gonna
say a Mini 4. Is there a Mini 4 Pro? I don't know. I just
I mean,
somebody told me to
maybe
get this one.
Pontic, but that's closed source too,
Yeah, that's what
right?
I'm saying. But I'm talking about just alternatives. As a regular consumer, such as myself, is there an American made alternative that I could have purchased and not have to worry about this stuff? And what is the cost difference? What would have cost me more to make
That's what I was
sure?
just about to ask. At the
Yeah.
same price range, at the same quality, no. But if you're talking about a difference in price range, well, then yes, there is. It's going to be a larger aircraft system. It's made more for commercial rather than prosumer applications, and it's going to cost you a decent chunk of change in
Like an arm
comparison to
and a
what.
leg, or just the leg? Like,
Well, maybe just the leg. If it all depends on how you value your own body parts on the black
okay,
market,
I
Christian.
guess
So
that's true.
that's up for debate.
But
But in any case,
so that's just
I
crazy.
think
To a regular consumer, that is just crazy that this is going on. That I have no alternative to get a quality product like this, elsewhere for, without selling a body part or two.
and let's granted there are probably some individuals trying to work on a solution to that very problem right now. But is it ready? Is it ready for prime time? Not that we've seen, but
Gotcha.
until someone else comes out and announces something like it, right? So this is one of the things why we're trying to talk about it, to bring more awareness to the factor of the difference between what we're talking about, like closed source firmwares versus open source firmwares, not just on autopilots but in software for controlling the drones too, and how those ecosystems can completely change the level of design or expertise needed to create something that is truly easy to use for the end user. I mean, that's where DJI got it right. That's where companies like Autel, DJI, they got it right, is because they released something that was simplistic
Mm-hmm.
to use. The human design, the human factors design that went into it, the human user interface, the considerations that went into it was a top priority. So as if this is what we're saying, like, learn more if you know more about and can learn more about the open source side, because right now there's a ban looming over all of our heads right now that if it keeps going further and further, we need more people in this industry besides those that are already in it who focus on the development of these systems to make something comparable and to create more of a competitive market so that we can actually get a price comparable to DJI or Autel or other closed source systems. Because when you're talking about $20,000 to $30,000 for a drone that you might have been able to get for $6,000 instead, there's no comparison. Especially when the ease of use of that lesser cost drone is already better than the one that we're thinking of, right? So it's this is the challenge that we are facing. That it is essentially, how do I put this? I'm not going to say being forced upon it, but conditions are being put in place that behooves individuals to go in that direction. Because if we don't, where are we?
Mm-hmm.
We're in a non-competitive place where we truly need to keep pushing, keep learning, and keep getting better as manufacturers ourselves to make us competitive in that space. So it goes back to Steve's question. It's not just about defense. It's how do we make ourselves competitive also in a global market on the commercial side as manufacturers? Because maybe one day we can see U.S. made drones being sold outside of the U.S. on a large enough scale comparable to that what was done by successors of the day.
Don't get me wrong, like the defense sector has a bunch of drones that are really good. Skydio has great drones, but the price point is not comparable to for consumer use. It's all the defense side and military side that is really innovating, but for the consumer side, we're kind of a little bit stifled right now.
Well, it's really cool is that even your military members that are using drones made from commercial companies in the United States from the NDA and Blue List are like that know how these systems work and understand the open source side of it and know ArduPilot or know PX4, know Betaflight even are saying like, hey, I could build that for less. And sure enough, Army, Navy, Marine Corps says, go forth and give it a shot. And sure enough, they do. They make a sub $1,000 system. I think there was a recent news report that came out that said there was I believe it was either Marine Corps or Army where someone, they're paying a little over $1,000 per drone from a third party vendor, and they were able to build one for $700 to $780 in comparison. So that's a drop by a few $100s per unit for something of the same capability.
But were they built for $700, or that's what they sold that contract for, $700 per drone? Because
No. That's what someone internally to the unit was able to build and do from the components but it doesn't necessarily account for the time spent assembling and making sure it can fly.
yeah.
So that's
and
the
then
other
and
part
market
too.
the retail pricing and all that stuff. So like I'm just putting it to the consumer, and yeah, you can make it cheaper, but if you're making it cheaper and it's still not cheap, and then you want to make money off of it, it's going to be still too crazy for a guy like me to purchase, or
Yeah,
a regular consumer.
okay, I like where this is going because we can get into a theoretical conversation here just a little bit. So the X500 V2 dev kits that we send out for UAS 213 design, build, and fly currently. Now, if anyone's watching this in the far future, that kit might have changed over time, just for anyone who's watching or is aware of this. But those kits, they sell retail for around $600, right? But now, do they have any sensors on them? No, not really. But could you make a 3D printed case? Could you add sensors to them? Could you make a use case around it for a small uncrewed aircraft systems for maybe another couple $100? And then if you're not greedy, say, okay, the whole cost of goods and assembly costs maybe $1,400 to make this thing. Could you sell that drone for $2,000 and make a couple $100 off of every unit? I mean, that's still a decent return on investment for what you're making, depending on the labor costs and other things to produce and build them at a large scale. So that's why I talked about like macroeconomics. But, in reality, there's the capability. It's just a matter of what are people wanting to charge for these things?
No, and
They
that's
wanna make a video.
I've seen what at cost, even for DJI drones, are as opposed to what MSRP is, and it's crazy. So the
Yeah.
markup is crazy. It's almost as crazy as bar liquor or movie theater popcorn. Like, so
Bar liquor.
I don't even know if there would be any manufacturers, especially if there's a short supply of American made quality drones, who's going to drop their pricing. And I know that's where you're saying, hey, that's why we need a more competitive market. But
It's going to take years.
It doesn't look good from a regular person standpoint, a regular consumer standpoint.
Correct.
And then I can't imagine for these people who have DJI like ag drones and stuff like that, like you said, who are spending tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars on either a fleet of drones or one singular drone to, spray their crops, how that's going to affect them in the long run.
So we're starting to come a little full circle, if I may. So like you said, there's the individuals with that investment. There's what we talked about with the FCC. They're retroactively saying that, okay, we're not allowing these anymore. So, and we go back to like we talked about with Cuba, saying like people have to maintain those things. What do you think what do you like? And I'm going to ask this of you, Don, primarily for your thoughts on this. Is if here in the United States, we're truly able to get more startup companies. We are able to get more drone developers. We are and able to get enough of them in the next maybe 3 to 4 years, or even 5 years, maybe half a decade, to where we're now on the same par as what we've experienced now with manufacturers like Autel and so forth. Do you think that it would provide enough gap for, because we know DJI made systems are actually pretty reliable systems. They barely need a lot of maintenance over a long time of flight hours accumulated. Do you think that time frame would leave enough of a gap for people to still use the tools that they're using commercial wise, as long as they're prepping for that time frame? And then for the rest of the industry to be able to form and develop and actually catch up and get to the same standard as what we were before. Yes, it stinks for the consumer because now products that are being released that are new from another company is not allowed to be acquired, but now more availability is being made to address the concerns that were put out at the beginning of this discussion.
So you mentioned a gap. I'm not understanding what you mean by a gap.
So gap to where we currently are as being developers and UAS manufacturers and what we can actually output compared to, where the DJIs and Autels and like even back in the day, like the Parrots could do, like from Europe, and to quality and user interface and so forth, and be able to time allowed to try to close that gap, because more people trained in how to develop, more people being able to start up companies to work towards development of this, more individuals that are now not just as hobbyists, but are now involved as a commercial investment into the open source communities, in which continue to grow and be made better by those who constantly contribute to the open source side of the community, then increases the pacing of the advancements and capabilities of those open source based drones. And again, ease of user interface design improves as well, closes that gap to the capabilities of those who have already figured out to those who can now try to catch up and be at the same space.
Well, that's a pretty loaded question. There's a lot to unpack there. First thing I want to say is that DJI has been 70 to 90% of the market share, or 80%, whatever it is, because they have the infrastructure to innovate. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think they make their own chipsets, do they not? So if they, regardless of making chipsets, they have the infrastructure to make it cheap and innovate quicker than we can, which they will continue to do. So if we can't supersede them in the next 3 to 5 years, I think 3 to 5 years is quite quick. I think it's going to be longer than that. But we in the U.S. side, in the national airspace in the U.S. and the infrastructure, we need to have that in place to be able to catch up or at least supersede DJI in the future. And I don't foresee that happening in 3 years. That's a pretty quick time frame. I more so anticipate probably in the next 10 years, closer to 10 years. But yeah, I think the infrastructure is the most important part, so that we can create the demand in the industry and drive prices lower.
Yeah, this is where and you're right, it goes back into the macroeconomics of things and the overall infrastructure, because we need chip makers, not just chip makers, we need PCB developers and creators and manufacturers at a very large scale, not just for the autopilots and the companion computers, but also for electronic speed controllers. I mean, there's some motor manufacturers here in the United States already. KDE is one of them, and they're a pretty popular motor manufacturer. but it's also the abundance of that here in the United States, because right now it's still very limited. There's a very small group of people that actually manufacture components that can be used to build or develop drones that are, ready to buy, that you can just plug in and use it with the system that you want to create. But then there's also the factor of, well, when I mention macroeconomics, I mean cost of the individuals developing this stuff, right? And it's like individuals over in China may be trained up to be engineers and be able to be experts in CAD design and coding and manufacturing by the time they leave high school. Do we have that here? Not necessarily. In some areas, maybe private schools and VOTEC schools, yes. But and that's the cool thing about SDI, because we are one of those kind of training trade companies where we actually can teach individuals that specific niche, and it's something that won't like cost someone to be paying off student loans for a long term of their lifetime afterwards. So the more ability that we have to offer, and then be able to train individuals at a sub 100, or even if I dare say the cost of a mortgage for education, the more we can get individuals into this space that can hopefully make that a more rapid pace. And then because we're reducing the overall cost of education, because if we think about it, well, it's also not just cost of education, it's cost of living. There's a lot of things. That's why I'm saying macroeconomics, because if things don't become cheaper to do, to make something in a place that's not cheap to do it, it's always going to be more expensive than the place that can produce it cheaper. So like you said, infrastructure, and then there's a ton of other components into this. So it's going to be an interesting next few years, I will say.
Yep.
Okay.
But who knows? Maybe there could be a time where, the security review is actually done even after its due date, and, it's brought back to the table, and then, things get released. Who knows?
Yeah.
The
I'm
future
going to
is
hope
an
for that.
interesting-
I'm either hoping for an extension or somebody just ups and does it and whatever. So I want to be able to use my drones. I want to start this new, from the guns to the drones thing, learn more about that, at least as much as I know about the gun side. But final thoughts. We're running on time. Let's, what does everybody got? Sum it up for us.
So to sum it up, would you guys agree that like open source or closed source makes flying easier, but open source makes the learning deeper? Like it opens up more doors.
I would say that's correct. Closed source doesn't always mean better designed. You could have a company that closed sources their firmware and the user design is crap, and you can't really use it too well. But yes, open source, to learn the open source, to learn about all the different softwares out there and learn about the community, it opens up your possibilities more as an operator or someone in the industry.
If you think you're an expert because you fly a DJI drone, you need to get into the open source side and learn about that ecosystem, because that's where the industry is going.
Mic drop.
Shots fired.
Right.
Yes. And I'll tack on that. So to say, okay, you've told me this. Now, where do I begin? Where do I go? Well, SDI is a great place because we focus on both the closed source and open source side of things. We teach about both sides, but at the same time, look into other resources out there. Look into ArduPilot.org. Look to the Drone Code Foundation. Look to Q Ground Control. Look to Mission Planner. Look to Betaflight. Look to iNav. All of these individual things will lead you to, and there's a world of online documentation that you can read and to learn more. There's YouTube, there's all the conferences that these communities have had are recorded and on YouTube and available to watch as well. So educate yourself even more so as much as you can about these things, because the knowledge behind them, it's what I like to refer to as the world within the world. Because without these things being developed and created, drones don't advance.
Yeah.
You say knowing is half the battle?
Knowing is 80 to 90% of the battle.
Yeah.
Would you say the future is up in the air?
A good one.
Our future is always up in the air. Good sir. And who knows, maybe at some point up in space.
Well, hopefully I didn't waste thousands of dollars on drones. But if you have any more questions or want more information on our programs here, go to sdi.edu today, hit request information, talk to one of our admissions reps. For Steve, Don, James, I've been Christian, and this has been this week's episode of the Flight Path. Say bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.